Wealth. In this video, I want to talk about the richest countries in the world. But first, we need to define what is being a rich country. We could get into a whole philosophical discussion about this, how money doesn't equal wealth, how countries with big GDPs like the US might not actually be as rich for the people as countries with smaller GDPs, because the rich nations might not properly invest their money in the right areas. But those are discussions for another video, although I might circle back to a few of those ideas a couple times here. In this video, I just want to show you what the richest countries in the world are from a GDP point of view. For this, we'll take into account 4 main criteria. 1. The total GDP value. 2. GDP per capita. 3. Distribution of wealth, so checking if a rich country equally and fairly shares its wealth amongst its people. And finally, 4. GDP growth or reduction, to see how it's evolving. Let's start with the first one, total GDP value. In case you don't know, GDP stands for gross domestic product. Essentially, it is the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. The top 10 richest countries from number 10 to number 1 are Canada, Brazil, Italy, France, the UK, India, Germany, Japan, China, and the US. However, if we count the European Union as a whole instead of just the individual countries, it occupies the 2nd place worldwide, not too far from the US. Although we should note as well that the top 2/3 are very much ahead of the rest. In this map, we can have a general overview of the world. The darker the blue, the higher the GDP, the lighter the blue, the lower the GDP. According to this data, the 5 poorest countries in the world in terms of GDP are the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Tuvalu. All of these are island nations and thus have severe limitations, if nothing else because they don't have a lot of room. In fact, it's interesting to note that there is somewhat of a correlation between country size and GDP size, although we also see cases of very small countries with big GDPs, like Belgium, Denmark, the United Arab Emirates, or Singapore. In geographic terms, let's take a look at how things are. I'll just go by the color intensity and not get into specific values as to not get too confusing and unnecessarily specific. North America has rich countries. The United States have the biggest economy worldwide, and Canada and Mexico have high results as well. Central America and the Caribbean, however, don't do as great. South America varies a lot. Brazil has a high GDP, although it has suffered a reasonable amount in the past years. Argentina, Chile, and Colombia occupy the 2nd tier. Peru, Ecuador, and Uruguay the 3rd. Bolivia, Paraguay, and Venezuela are next, and then Suriname and Guyana get the worst results. French Guiana just has France's value. Europe has very good results overall. This is why the EU occupies the number 2 slot in the ranking. The biggest economy is Germany, followed by the UK, Italy, France, and Spain. Then we have some 2nd tier but also very good results in Switzerland, Austria, Poland, etc. The Nordic countries have high GDPs, with the exception of Iceland, but they're a perfect example of one of the things I mentioned earlier. The highest GDP doesn't necessarily mean the highest quality of life for the people. Scandinavia and Finland have high GDPs, true, but not the highest, yet their quality of life and happiness of their people always occupy the highest places on those rankings, showing us that it's not just about how much money is generated in the country, but how much of that money goes to the state and the people, and how those agents are able to organize and distribute it, generating quality of life. The rest of Europe has reasonable results, like Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, or Greece, but some do not so great, like Bosnia, Albania, and Moldova. Before we go on, a quick message about today's sponsor. I know sponsored messages can be annoying sometimes, I always say this, but they really do help the channel. Plus, this is another great one from my point of view. These days, we're always on our phones, on social media, on our laptops, working or watching a TV show. We don't have a lot of free time, but the time we do have, we don't usually spend learning. Most people would say that they don't have the time, attention span, or patience to read a book, for instance, and this jeopardizes our ability to learn. This is where today's sponsor comes in, Blinkist. Blinkist is an app that gathers thousands of non-fiction books and condenses them or summarizes them into 15-minute reads, or listening sessions. This way, you can access information or knowledge that would usually take several hours to acquire in just 15 minutes or so. Now, I'll be honest, I like reading and I usually take some time to do that. But a lot of days, I just don't have enough patience to sit down and read 2 or 3 chapters. And Blinkist allows you to always stay informed, not just when you happen to have time to do so. I've started using it and found 2 really interesting reads immediately. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari and The Republic by Plato, both summarized in 19 and 16 minutes, respectively. The first 100 people to go to the link at the top of the description are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. The 7-day trial is completely free and you can cancel it at any time during that period. So click the link in the description to learn more. Now back to the video. The Middle East and the Caucasus are a big mix. The highest GDP country of this area is Saudi Arabia, followed by Turkey, Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria also have decent results. The other ones aren't great, and also seem somewhat unrealistic values if I'm being honest, taking into account the instability we all know exists in some of these countries. Africa is unfortunately mostly towards the light or very light blue, with the exception of the Maghreb region. Only a few countries manage to have higher GDPs, such as South Africa, Angola, Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, Kenya, or this country here. Asia has, I believe, the highest concentration of countries with high GDPs, and seems like it's definitely the richest continent from this point of view. China is the highest here and number 2/3 worldwide, and we also have very high values in Japan, India, South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, and Singapore, plus very strong second-tier countries, Malaysia, the Philippines, or Taiwan. There's a few with less great results like Mongolia or the Istans in Central Asia, but overall, good results. Finally, Oceania does very well. Australia has a good GDP and New Zealand follows, but also being very good. Papua New Guinea is low, as are the island nations. We already saw total GDP value. Now let's see GDP per capita. Again, if you are unfamiliar with the term, GDP per capita is a measure of a country's economic output that accounts for its number of people. It divides the GDP by its total population. Here it becomes evident how some very small countries have high GDPs because they instantly jump to the top of the list. Monaco and Liechtenstein are number 1 and number 2, followed by Luxembourg, Switzerland, Macau, Norway, Ireland, Qatar, Iceland, the United States, Singapore, Denmark, and Australia. This type of rating is somewhat lacking in the aspect that it misrepresents wealth. Countries that have large populations are hurt in the ranking unless they have gigantic GDPs to match it. We can also see the differences from the previous map in that aspect. China, for instance, who occupies number 2 or 3 worldwide, follows to number 66 in per capita because it has so many people. The EU would rank at around number 25 worldwide in average of its member countries. In the worldwide map, the greener, the better, the redder, the worse. Here, Asia is clearly not as great as it seemed to be in the previous map because so many people live in Asia. Japan and South Korea are the exceptions, as well as other small regions like Macau or Singapore. South and Central America also suffer a lot, as well as Mexico, and Africa does even worse than before, with only 3 or 4 countries managing to reach yellow and none in the green. Europe does somewhat better, but it's important to note that the previous highest ranks are replaced. Instead of Germany and the UK, we now have Luxembourg, Switzerland, Monaco, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Ireland leading the charts. Iceland is a fantastic example. It had a low ranking in terms of total GDP, but since it has very few people, it's one of the highest in GDP per capita. However, GDP per capita is just a simple division of the total GDP value by the number of people living in the country, and so its results can be a little misleading. It's that whole story. If you have a country with 100 people and on average the population eats 100 chickens a day, you can say, oh, each person gets 1 chicken, but that's not necessarily true. You can have 50 people eating 2 chickens and the other 50 starving. So in order to understand if wealth is properly distributed, we need to use another type of ranking, the Gini coefficient or Gini index, called Gini because it was developed by Italian statistician Corrado Gini. The Gini index is intended to represent the income or wealth distribution of a nation's residents and is the most commonly used measurement of inequality. I won't get into the math behind it because, to be honest, I myself don't know enough math to understand it, but what we need to know is that it measures countries' inequalities in income distribution by ranking them from 0 to 100 or 0 to 1 if you just want to use decimals. If the value is 0, then there is perfect equality. If the value is 1 or 100%, depending how you're measuring, then that means total inequality in the sense that one person has all the wealth concentrated in them and everybody else has nothing. An index value of 50 above is considered high. Now, this data is somewhat outdated because apparently these measures aren't done very frequently, and to make it worse, they don't match. So some countries might present data from 2017, others from 2014, others from 2011, but it's the information we have, so let's go with it. Again, the higher the value, the worse, and on the map, green is good, red is bad. It's worth noting that the best result is of 25 when total equality would mean 0. All of America has very bad results, the worst being in Bolivia and Colombia. The US aren't terrible, not crossing the 50 threshold, but being very close to do that. The only country in the green is Canada. Europe is very decent, most are in the average green with some doing very well, especially Scandinavia, Finland, Germany, Austria, Czechia, Slovakia, and a few I was surprised with, maybe for prejudice on my end, but Serbia, Bulgaria, the Ukraine, and Belarus, and others sadly more towards the light green, having less income equality. The UK, the Baltic nations, Italy, and Portugal. The last tier has very similar results to the Middle East, for instance. North Africa in general has okay results, with the exceptions of Morocco and Tunisia, plus some missing data. The further south you go, the worse the results, with Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa having some of the worst results worldwide, with the biggest income inequalities. In Africa, Ethiopia has the best results. In Asia, results are very decent as well, although the average equality is a little less than Europe's, for instance. Japan does the best, followed by South Korea. In Oceania, things are okay too, with the exception of Papua New Guinea. In terms of an actual ranking, these are the 10 countries with the most income equality, from number 10 to number 1. Belgium, Norway, Iceland, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Moldova, Slovakia, Belarus, Czechia, and Slovenia. Keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean that the average person is richer in these countries. It just means that the difference between the amount of money the richest person has and the poorest person has is smaller. So if everyone is really poor, then perfect equality would exist, but even if fair, that wouldn't necessarily be good. On the other end, the 10 countries with the most income inequality are Belize, Brazil, Mozambique, Eswatini, Central African Republic, São Tomé e Príncipe, Zambia, Suriname, Namibia, and South Africa. We can also see the evolution of some countries worldwide in the last 70 years. In Brazil, the US, and China, inequality has gone up. Mexico has been able to reduce it a little, and in general, it seems that sadly, inequality is going up. Speaking of evolution, and finally, we can take a look at the final criteria: GDP evolution. Going back to the first criteria of total GDP and just seeing very briefly how they have evolved in the past years. This data is from 2017 too. The good news is that at the time, and I think it's sort of maintained over the past couple of years, most of the world is growing. Also important to remember that a very poor country or a country out of a deep recession is more likely to grow a lot in percentage, while stable countries with good economies have more stable and reduced growth rates. So more percentage isn't necessarily a synonym of being a rich nation. The biggest growths have been in Asia for sure. The Middle East has suffered a lot, as usual, as some specific countries that face challenges internally, while others who have perhaps been able to go through those challenges and overcame them show higher rates of growth. So, to sum up, And taking these 4 criteria into account, we can basically say that it's very hard to determine which countries are the richest. Each criteria has its good sides, showing us important information, but also its faults. Total GDP only shows us the value of what was produced, not how it was used. Per capita is biased by population size, the Gini index shows equality but not average amounts, and growth rates can be bigger in countries that are poorer. Plus, we also have the whole thing of considering more money the main factor of wealth. Essentially, and in my opinion, the richest countries aren't those with the higher GDPs. Obviously that the highest the GDP, the better, and the more it continuously grows, the better, but what's most important is that its distribution is fair, that the Gini index shows equality, but that the equal value distributed to each is enough for them to fulfill their needs, and that the state also has enough and invests/uses it well enough to provide the fulfillment of basic needs to its population, allowing them to have healthcare, education, quality jobs, access to property, freedom, parental rights, individual rights, and so many more things that might require a high GDP, but that are much more important than that GDP value on its own. So that was a quick look at what might be the world's richest countries. Thanks so much for watching the video. As usual, leave your opinions below. Do you agree with my view and or these rankings? Plus, leave any suggestions for future videos. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.